Our first reading is from the 45th chapter of Genesis. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For this famine has been in the land for these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep you alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that his brothers talked with him. Holy wisdom, holy word.
The good news of God in Jesus Christ according to St. Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus says, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even the sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." This is truly good news from Jesus. My great-grandmother. Now, when I say my great-grandmother, this is not Granny of my stories, because Granny is perfect. Don't shatter my dreams, okay? This is Granny's mother-in-law. We all know what mother-in-laws are like, right? This is Granny's mother-in-law. She was persnickety. She was mean-spirited. She was bitter. And we used to go visit her after church on Sundays. Not every Sunday, but every once in a while. But I really liked to see my grandfather. He was a very thin man, and he made quilts by hand, and he also had a sewing machine that he made these with, and I have one of those as a gift when he died. But my grandmother was a very large woman. I mean, so large that when she died, she had to have a special casket made for her that was the size of a grand piano. And that's no joke. The people who had to carry her knew that they were carrying a heavy weight. Her bitterness was as big as she was. And I remember all kinds of stories that my granny used to tell about her. But what I remember most is that she only went to church when she wanted to check out what was going on. And she would sit right on the back row. Maybe that's why Lutherans do that. No, she sat right on the back row and she watched every person that came in. And the person sitting beside her knew that they were going to get all the good gossip. And she would sit there and she would gossip about everything. And this was back in the day whenever people got married and you didn't have relations with anyone until you got married. You know, those days of much more puritanical living. And she would look at somebody, and a young woman would walk in with her new husband, and they'd been married for, 6, 8 months, maybe a year. And she would say in her loudest whisper, "Have they been married long enough? Looks like she's pregnant." You know, she would say things like that. That's how bitter she was. And I asked one time, why was she that way? And Granny said, well, she had at least one child before she married, and she was so embarrassed by the family that she went and left the child on the steps of the courthouse, and the judge knew her and took the baby back and gave it to her. So she was very bitter because of the things that had happened in her life, but then she wanted to point out the mistakes of everybody. Everybody. It reminds me of Flannery O'Connor's story, Revelation. Now, Flannery O'Connor she's no longer alive, but she wrote stories that are modern-day parables, and they're still very important for us today. And one of them that's they're all very good, but one of them that's very poignant for today is called Revelation. Ms. Turpin is this really large woman, and you realize how small a room is whenever she walks in, and she has taken over the room, and she's looking at everybody, and this room is a doctor's office, and she looks at everyone, and she looks at this little boy. Well, he should have gotten up whenever I walked in, because it's in the South after all. He should have gotten up. He must not have had good upbringing. And then she looks over in another seat, and there's this little girl, and she has all of these pimples all over her face, and she just looks awful. Mrs. Turpin is thinking all these things in her mind, and she just obviously doesn't have good nutrition in her life, and she's thinking of all these things. Well, this girl has had enough after she hears this conversation of this sickening, sweet, and also biting humor of this woman that she picks up her book and she throws it at her and calls her a warthog. And they wrestle the girl to the ground, give her a shot to calm her down, and send her off to the hospital. And Miss Turpin goes home and tells everybody in town, I don't know what was wrong with that girl. She's obviously got some mental problems. When she had antagonized the girl to that point. She doesn't really, the revelation comes at the very end. She doesn't realize that she is the problem until she sees this vision of all these people coming up the street, and they all are wearing the clothes that are not appropriate, and wearing the things that they're not supposed to wear, and doing the things they're not supposed to do, and acting the ways they're not supposed to act. And she receives that revelation from God as she sees they're all singing hallelujah and going up to heaven. And she realizes then, maybe I am the problem. You see, I think about that because I feel sorry for my grandmother, my great-grandmother, because she never could accept, she never could believe or trust in that grace from God that Jesus talks to us about today. Jesus says, forgive and you will be forgiven. Everything will be given back to you in the same measure that you give it. We even say that in the Lord's Prayer, don't we? We say, forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. In other words, in the same measure. Forgive us in the same measure that we've forgiven others. How do I forgive others? Just a little bit? Okay, maybe a little more? Or do I forgive like God? Well, the reality is we can't forgive like God, can we? We all know the things in our lives that we have done. We all know the ways we've messed up, and we know that God has forgiven us. And that gives us the impetus then, or should, to share that with others. Look how much God has done for me. But the problem is we usually end up ashamed of those things, don't we? And we hide them deep down inside. And we end up like Miss Turpin or my grandmother, and we like to point out, well, look at that one. Look at that one. Look at that one. But every time we do that, aren't we really pointing out how good God's grace is? I'm not saying to do that. What I'm saying is what we're not realizing in ourselves is that God's grace is so good, God's forgiveness is so good to us that sometimes we forget that. And we become bitter. We become the ones who point out the mistakes in others. We become those who forget. We need to be reminded. We need to know for sure deep down inside that God really does care for me. And God really does forgive me and love me. God really is merciful, as Jesus says. Be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. The great good news today, and this really is good news, the great good news for us is that Jesus has forgiven every one of us in great measure. And He's forgiven us in such measure that we can't even count how many times God has forgiven us. And the great good news is that we can accept that today. We can believe it. We can trust it. We can take it to the bank, as it were. Take that good grace with you. Believe it deep down in your heart. And don't just keep it to yourself. Share it with other people. Share it with the person beside you. Cindy, share it with Bill. He needs to know. Doesn't he? Dwayne, he needs to know about God's grace. All of us need to know that. We all need to hear that all the time. Because this life, if you haven't looked around, there are too many people who are pushed down by the things in life. Look what's happening in Rome lately. All of the church is met together, the Catholic Church, in order to talk about the problem, the elephant in the room in the Catholic Church. And Jesus says to us, forgive your abusers. Doesn't mean forget it. God gives that gift. But forgive and let it go. Forgive Osama bin Laden. Forgive. Put in the worst enemy you can think of. Forgive. Because whenever we hold on to it, what we're really doing is taking that inside, holding it really close to us so that we're thinking this is more powerful than God's promise to us that forgiveness and love are ours. Let it go. Doesn't mean that we don't have to be reasonable about this and make changes in our lives and make changes in the church, make changes in society, but it does mean that we get to live as freely as God has created us to live. So accept and trust that promise today that God forgives you, and you can share it with others. Amen.